Buenos días para todos. Good morning, Dr. Neil Polhemus. Can you hear us?
Good morning.
Hi, good morning, Dr. Polhemus. Thank you so much for being with us today. We know you're a very busy person, so we are very appreciative of your time, and you're very welcome here.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure.
Great. So as you know, this is a series of web presentations that we will have as a preview to the Latin American Convention on Quantitative Methods and Risk Management that will be taking place in Cartagena on September 11 and 12. We will be presenting some of the trends and topics that we're going to be covering during the convention. But of course, we want to see everyone in Cartagena. It's a beautiful city, and of course, nothing will replace the experience of meeting the expert speakers, such as yourself, and sharing with peers from all over Latin America. Besides taking time away from the office, and again, a beautiful city to visit. We are also very excited with the recent announcement of a new version of Statgraphics coming out, the version 17. Which we hope that during your presentation today we can take a sneak peek, and we'll look fully at the presentation and functionalities on your presentations in Cartagena.
Sounds very exciting, the convention.
Great. So, and also at the end of this presentation, we're going to have about 15 minutes where attendees will be able to ask questions. Again, you can send them to me by chat, and we'll be translating to English, so you can, read them back to the attendees.
Very good.
Thank you again. We're very pleased to have you here, and you're welcome to start the presentation time series analysis at any time.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be able to present this webinar today. It's a topic I'm actually very interested in. Have been all these years since I was a graduate student, actually. The analysis of time series. And what I'll be doing is I'll be showing you some features in Statgraphics Centurion in particular, that will allow you to analyze time series data. When we talk about time series, what we're talking about is sequentially ordered data. And that is data that are collected typically once a day, once a year, once a month, something like that. The standard notation takes a look at the variable y and subscripts it with time. And what becomes particularly important when you talk about time series is the fact that the observations are ordered, which means they're typically not independent unless you happen to have a random series, which we don't see very often in practice. Instead, the data are correlated over time, correlated with themselves at previous time periods, which we would call autocorrelation. The topics I'm going to cover today are several. I'm going to start by giving you a sneak peek at what we've added to version 17 of Statgraphics Centurion. In particular, we've added a number of procedures for visualizing multiple time series.
Dr. Polhemus, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you share your screen for us, please?
You're not seeing the screen, okay? Let me get back to where I need to be. Sorry about that. Okay, I need to figure out, share my desktop. There we go. Is that better?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. I apologize for that. As I had said a moment ago, what we will be looking at today is the analysis of sequentially ordered data, data that are ordered over time. The topics I'm going to cover, first off, I will talk about dynamic visualization. Show you some of the new features that are added to version 17. Version 17 is scheduled for release later in the summer. Right now it's in beta test, and I'll be running a beta test version. I don't expect to find any problems, but it is just a test version in case I do. But it will be ready for public release late in the summer. I'm going to also talk about some descriptive methods. I'm going to talk about forecasting. And finally, toward the end, talk about analyzing some seasonal data. Now, the data that I'm going to be looking at first today is data that I obtained from the World Bank. It's a data set containing demographic and economic statistics for 26 countries in the Western Hemisphere. All of the countries in Latin America, South America, and also Canada and the United States and Mexico here in North America. The time period of interest is the years 1961 through 2010. That's a 50-year period. The variables in the file, some of the variables we'll be looking at are life expectancy at birth, both for males and females, age dependency ratio, which is the percent of the working population, fertility rate, and that's births per female, infant mortality rate, which are some demographics, and then the economic statistics are GDP per capita, consumer price inflation, gross domestic savings. Now, the first topic will be visualization. And I'm going to be showing you several new procedures in version 17 designed to visualize data. We have procedures for visualizing a single time series, for comparing two time series, and for visualizing multiple time series. I'll try to show you each one of those because they each have something interesting to look at. So let me now switch over, if I can, to Statgraphics. This is Statgraphics version 17 with the data set I just talked about loaded. If you're familiar with version 16 of Statgraphics, you'll notice that in terms of the layout, not a lot has changed. We have made some additions to the analysis toolbar, which you'll see at the top, over top of the data, with some new features that I'll be demonstrating as I go along. We've added a session log to the data, to the system, so that it will keep track of everything that's happened during the session and allow you to print that out at the end. I'm going to start, though, by showing you what some of this data looks like. And to do that, I'm going to select Plot and start with a simple scatter plot in XY plot. Now, the data I thought I'd start with is total life expectancy. And I'm going to plot here life expectancy by year. This is just a typical scatter plot, the same as you might have seen in version 16. You can see, though, that life expectancy in every one of the countries in this data set has increased pretty dramatically over the last 50 years. For every country, it's gone from anywhere between about 42 to 72 years up to at least 60 years and as many as 80 years in 2010. Now, one of the new features that I did add to version 17 is this light bulb here. This is the new highlight feature. This will allow me to quickly, in any graph that I'm looking at, highlight particular data points. I'm going to, for example, click on country here, and it's now color-coded for you the data from Argentina. So you can see actually each of these lines on the graph is a single country. If I click on a different country like Barbados, you can see that, or Bolivia, or Brazil, or Canada, or Chile, or Colombia. I can also push the cycle button and it will cycle now through the different countries. It's one way of attempting to visualize multiple time series by looking at each time series separately. And if I sit here, it will just cycle through the different countries. Hopefully you can see your country when it gets to it as it cycles through. We allow you in version 17 to do this sort of highlighting on any scatter plot. It's particularly useful on data like the data we're looking at today. Okay. All right. Well, that's a fairly simple visualization technique if you have multiple samples to highlight a particular sample. If you wanted now to go in, for example, and compare life expectancy of men and women, we'd have to do something a little bit more complicated. This is total life expectancy of everyone. To do this, I'm going to go to actually a new section on the Statgraphics menu. This is a section you would not have seen if you've been using version 16. It's a section containing what are called statlets. Statlets are interactive procedures that allow you to interact with your data in different ways. To start, I'm going to select what's called the Multivariate Dynamic Visualizer. This will allow me to pick multiple time series. I'm going to start actually by picking life expectancy of males, life expectancy of females. Now in this statlet, I'm allowed to slice the data. So I'm going to slice the data by year, which means it's going to give me pictures of different years. I'm also going to identify the points by country. Okay. Now, it's come up with a bar chart, and what I'm going to do actually is move things around a little bit here to make it look a little nicer. This is something you can do in version 16. I don't know how many people do it, but you can easily move things around. I'm also going to reduce the text size a little bit so it looks nicer on the screen. I'm going to right-click, go to Analysis Options, and ask it to use a common scale. And right now it was scaling men and women differently, which I didn't really want to do. Okay. Now, what we have here is a display of life expectancy for males. That's the blue bar, and life expectancy for females, that's the red bar. Right now, it's 1961 that we're looking at. One thing you'll notice, in pretty much every country in my data set, females tend to live longer than males. I guess there's nothing, everyone knows that. But you can see all the red bars are a little bit higher than the blue bars. Now, if I push one of the buttons on the toolbar here, I can let time run. And you may notice if you look at the title of the graph that it's allowing the years now to change. And you can see as the years increase from 1961 up to 2010, life expectancy in all of the countries is going up. This little arrow here will actually allow it to repeat. Now, one thing you can see actually is there is a bigger difference in some countries than others in the difference between male and female life expectancy. For example, countries like El Salvador, okay, have considerably higher life expectancies for females than males. Mm-hmm. Well, that's called a multivariate visualizer. I have another visualizer under statlets that's also quite interesting for looking at data like this. It's called the one-dimensional dynamic visualizer. This allows me to look at more than one variable at the same time. Now, the way I like to run this, I'd like to put in life expectancy where it lists the field for Y. I'm going to slice by year. I'm going to identify by country. Now, what it's going to do, it's going to actually make a bubble chart. And we can pick other variables to define both the size and color of the bubbles. I'll pick age dependency ratio for the size. I'll pick the difference between males and females to define the color of the bubbles. Okay. When I press OK, it'll open up a window, a new statlet window with bubbles for each of the countries. Now, I do want to change a few things here. I want to rotate the labels around a little bit so it's easier to see. I want to reposition the labels here, maybe even reduce the size a little bit so you can see them. Now, what we're going to see, right now there is a bubble for every one of the countries and how they were in 1961. Size of the bubble is the percent of the entire population that's in the labor force. A large bubble means a large proportion of the population in that country is in the labor force. A small bubble means a smaller proportion. Color defines the difference between males and females. Now, I want to make a couple changes. I'm going to right-click, go to Analysis Options. First thing I'm going to do is change the minimum bubble size. Some of the bubbles tend to disappear if they're too small. I'm also going to change the color scale, let it go from 0 to 10. The color is the difference in life expectancy between males and females. So I'll make it 0 to 10 by 2.5. I also want to go down to where it says missing values and tell it to, if it detects any missing values, to assume the data was the same as the previous year. Okay. So this is what things looked at like back in 1961. Life expectancy varying anywhere from about 42 up to 72 years, depending upon what the country was. Now, we'll start this running, and you can see as time goes on, the life expectancy in every one of the countries rose. You can also see, though, that where everybody started green, let me stop this for a second, either green or blue, as time goes on, you see some yellows and some red appear, meaning that actually in certain countries, including the United States I see over here, the difference in life expectancy between males and females rose for a while. Now, so you can see this even a little better. One thing we allow you to do in these visualizers is to display breadcrumbs. If I right-click, go to Analysis Options, I can tell it to leave breadcrumbs for all the bubbles. What breadcrumbs are, well, you'll see what they are. It'll leave behind an image of what the bubble looked like in previous years. So if you take a look at something like this, you can see the path followed by every country as life expectancy increased. You can see countries like El Salvador started with fairly similar life expectancies for males and females. At some point over that 50-year period, the difference became quite a bit greater. You can also see by the size of the bubbles how the age dependency ratio, the percent of the population in the workforce, has changed. If you look at some countries, for example, Barbados over here, you see that the bubble's gotten a lot smaller as time has gone along. That means that a smaller and smaller proportion of the population is now in the workforce. Other countries like Bolivia here, you can see, did not change much in size, meaning that the percent of the population in the workforce is pretty much the same now as it was 50 years ago. Mm-hmm. The nice thing about these visualizers is the movement allows you to see things that you might not be able to see without this sort of dynamic display of the data. Well, I call that a one-dimensional visualizer because the points, the bubbles, are moving only in one direction. We can move the bubbles in two directions. If we go back to the Statlets menu again and ask for a two-dimensional visualizer. Now, what I thought I would do here is I thought I'd put life expectancy, total life expectancy on the y-axis, put the difference between males and females on the x-axis, slice by year, identify by country. For bubble size, I'm going to use fertility rate. That's the number of children per woman in the country. And for the color, I'll use the infant mortality rate. Okay. Now, what this is going to do is this is going to give me a two-dimensional display of bubbles. Okay, and I'm going to change just a couple things here before I let it run through time. I'm going to go to Analysis Options, make the minimum bubble size 4. I'm going to scale infant mortality to go from 0 to 150 by 25. I'm going to set missing values to be the same as previous. And now I'll let it go. And we'll watch now what happens as time evolves. You see life expectancy going up. You also see the differences between males and females changing. A general tendency, perhaps, for an increasing difference between males and females. You also see, though, all of the countries becoming much bluer than they were at the beginning. That's because of the change in infant mortality. Now, it is sometimes worth following certain countries. If I right-click and go to Analysis Options, I'm going to select, for example, El Salvador, Colombia, and Haiti. Okay. Ask it to label all the bubbles and to leave breadcrumbs for the selected bubbles. Okay. I now have a name on top of each of the bubbles, and as I let this run, it will leave breadcrumbs for the 3 bubbles I selected. And you can see a fairly dramatic change in El Salvador over time. You can follow Haiti and also Colombia as they move through time. Again, we're now visualizing several different variables over time and how they change. Now, these visualizers are actually quite interesting. It adds a dynamic to the graph that you wouldn't see in any static display. Okay. Well, that was the first topic I wanted to show you. That was all new for version 17. I wanted to give you a sneak peek at what we've done in terms of visualization. Getting back to some of the more mathematical techniques for handling time series, the second thing I wanted to talk about had to do with descriptive statistics. The classic time series model considers a time series to consist of 4 components. Trend, which are long-term changes in the process mean. Cycle, which are things like business cycles that have no particular fixed frequency. Seasonality, which is a fixed up and down at a fixed frequency, such as one cycle every 12 months. And then finally, randomness. The basic models for time series look at either the data as being a product of these different components in the case of a multiplicative model, or the sum of the different components in the case of an additive model. The tools that Statgraphics contains for looking at time series data from a mathematical and statistical perspective are the autocorrelation function, which shows how correlated observations are as a function of the distance between them, and the periodogram, which we use to identify potential cycles in the data. Now, in order to illustrate this in Statgraphics, I'm going to minimize some of my windows here, and I'll go on the top menu to describe time series. There's a section of procedures on the top menu for describing time series. The data I thought I'd look at here is going to be GDP per capita. That's gross domestic product of the country divided by the population. We're going to look at this by year. And down in the select field, I'm going to pick a particular country to look at. In this case, I'm going to type country equals Colombia. Okay, so that will pick out of the data set the data for Colombia. Now, I have the option in Statgraphics of doing various things to the data before I look at it. I can take transformations of the data. I can take out trends. I can adjust for inflation. I'm not going to do any of that. I'm just going to take all the defaults. I'll ask for the horizontal time sequence plot, an autocorrelation function, and a periodical. You know, this is a picture of what the GDP per capita in Colombia did over the last 50 years. Quite a dramatic rise, almost tripled between 1960 and 2010. Mm-hmm. And it was a pretty steady trend up, except for a little bit of a blip here in 1998, 99, but then got back on track and headed up in a positive direction again. That's a plot of the original data. The autocorrelation function is the function that shows how correlated observations are from one, depending upon how far apart they are. The first bar shows the autocorrelation between observations 1 year apart, the second 2 year apart, the second, third 3 years apart, and so forth. Anything beyond those red lines is statistically significant at the 95% level. Well, what you can see, as you would see for any data that are trending as strongly as these, is that the correlation between observations persists over many, many years. Well, that's just a picture, really, of the correlation caused by the trend. When we do have data with a strong trend, which is often called non-stationary data, it's usually a good idea to click the right mouse button, go to Analysis Options, and ask to difference the data. If I ask for one order of differencing, what it's going to plot for me instead of the original data is the change in the data from 1 month to the next, to the next, to the, 1 year to the next, to the next, to the next. Each point on the y-axis here is the change from 1 year to the next. Well, what you can see is that the changes from 1 year to the next, how much GDP goes up, and it does go up typically every year, is fairly random. There's a little bit of positive correlation perhaps, but an awful lot of random fluctuations in the amount that the GDP goes up from 1 year to the next. The autocorrelation function shows only one lag right about here, which is even close to being statistically significant. So actually, how much the GDP goes up from 1 year to the next seems to be fairly random around a particular mean. That's the autocorrelation function. The periodogram is another graph that basically looks for components in that data at particular frequencies. What you're looking for if you look at a periodogram is you're typically looking for spikes. And there is one good spike in this particular data set corresponding to a period of about 16 years. That would imply that there is some cycle, some component in this particular time series, the difference time series, at about 16 years. Now, that may be largely due to this drop in 1999, but you can almost see a cycle at about 16 years. Whether that means anything or not, I don't know. It is something, though, that periodigram does suggest might be present in the data. Well, those are some of the descriptive tools in Statgraphics. Now, the nice thing about these tools is they help us develop forecasts. They help us come up with models that we can use to forecast future values of the time series. In forecasting, we talk about two general types of models. Auto-projective models, which are models which project past behavior into the future, and input-output models, which contain information typically from leading indicators. Now, in Statgraphics, we have two procedures for doing forecasting. We have one procedure where the user specifies the model to be fit, and the second procedure where the software tries a bunch of different models and picks the model that fits the best. Okay? I'm going to show you the use of the automatic model selection procedure. So let me go back to Statgraphics. On the menu, there is an option for forecasting. And here you can see I have a choice of user-specified model or automatic model selection. I'm going to choose the automatic model selection, and it's remembered my settings. It remembers that I was interested in GDP per capita for Colombia. I'm going to ask it to forecast what's likely to happen to the GDP for the 10 years following the end of my data. Now, if I press OK, it will, excuse me, if I press OK, it will show me the different models that it would like to fit. It would like to try random walks and means and different types of trends, moving averages, exponential smoothers, and also ARIMA models. That stands for automatic, autoregressive, integrated moving average models. Over on the right, I have an option for selecting the criterion to pick the best model. By default, it's set to something called the Akaike information criterion. That basically tries to minimize the mean squared error of the model, but also penalizes the models with lots of parameters to prevent overfitting of the data. If I press OK, it's going to go ahead and try a bunch of different models. I actually have to press OK twice. And it has decided that for the GDP per capita in Colombia, in a ARIMA model of orders 102 is the best fitting of all the models in the list. And you can see here the forecasts with 95% prediction limits. The models, as we would expect, forecast a pretty steady increase in the gross domestic product per capita in Colombia. Okay, so that's a picture of some of the forecasting procedures in Statgraphics. Now, I'd like to take the last few minutes I have and talk about one other topic, and that is seasonal time series. The data we were looking at before were not seasonal. They were yearly data, no regular ups and downs that you might have if you looked at monthly data. Seasonal data, seasonal time series are time series that contain a periodicity of a regular pattern. For example, monthly data often go up and down every 12 months. Daily data often have a periodicity of 7 days. Now, the second data set I want to look at, the seasonal data set, will be the U.S. unemployment rate. Our Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps track of what percentage of the labor force are out there looking for a job. And the latest figures back at the end of May is in the United States, the unadjusted rate is 6.1%. The seasonally adjusted rate, which is the rate when you take out the seasonal effects, is 6.3%. Now, the first thing I'm going to do with this particular data is I'm going to load it into Statgraphics, and I'm going to smooth it. So let me go back to Statgraphics, and let me actually clear off this particular data set. Okay, and open up a second data set, which is the unemployment rates. There they are. Okay, I have data starting in January of 2001. We're looking at the unemployment rate, and there's actually two columns, one for the unadjusted rate and one for the adjusted rate. If I wanted to plot the data with smoother, I could go to Describe Time Series Smoothing, and I'm going to take the unadjusted rate and ask it to smooth over months. Now, in Statgraphics, you can apply either a single smoother or two smoothers in sequence. A typical smoother that I'd use on monthly data would be a simple moving average of 12 points. Okay. Taking the defaults here will show you the unemployment rates, how it varied in the United States, with a smoother, which gives you a good idea of the underlying trends. Unemployment in the United States started out fairly low in 2001, about 4%, went up to around 6%, back down to 4%, and then in 2008, 2009, rose dramatically up to about 10%. It's been coming down over the last few years fairly steadily. Okay. Now, that is what's called a linear smoother. That's just a moving average. If I wanted to, I could also go back here and ask for a nonlinear smoother to be applied before I do the moving average. Something like a 3RSSH is a smoother that the Professor John Tukey developed based primarily on running medians of 3, which will first do what's called a resistance smooth. A resistance smooth is a smooth that's not very sensitive to outliers, and that'll be followed by the simple moving average. And you see, if you start with the resistance smooth and then do the moving average, it's even a little smoother than it was before. Okay. Well, I want to do one more thing. It'll take me only about 2 minutes, and then I'll open this for questions. And that is, I want to use that smoother I just showed you to do a little bit of a seasonal adjustment. A seasonal adjustment is a procedure designed to remove the seasonal component from a time series, leaving the other components behind. If you're using something like the multiplicative model for time series, to do a seasonal adjustment, you go in, you estimate the seasonal component, and then divide the data by the seasonal component. Okay? That's how the Bureau of Labor Statistics seasonally adjusts the data. And it's the seasonally adjusted data that's typically reported. To do that, last thing I'll do is I'll go to Describe Time Series Seasonal Decomposition. And the only thing I'll need to do on this dialog box is tell it that the length of seasonality is 12. It goes up and down every 12 months. Again, I could decide to do a transformation if I wanted. I could adjust for inflation if I wanted. I'm not going to do that. And I'm just going to ask instead for the trend cycle, the seasonal indices, and the seasonally adjusted data. And you can see the first thing that is done in a seasonal adjustment is a smoother is put through the data. You then look at each month. You take the ratio of the data to the smooth. It's sometimes called ratio to moving average. So you do that, for example, for all the Januaries and come up with an index, a seasonal index, showing on average what happens in January. You can see in the United States, unemployment is highest in January. Okay, the index is actually at about 109. compared to an average month, January tends to be about 9% higher. Okay. As the year goes on, the unemployment tends to drop quite low in April and May, jumps again in June and July when the students, college students, come back and look for jobs, but then drops again at the end of the year. Okay, so that is the seasonally adjusted, well, those are the seasonal indices. The actual seasonally adjusted data is this plot here, where you take the original data and divide by the seasonal index. Okay, well, that gives you, I hope, a pretty good overview of what Statgraphics contains. Well, when I went to automatic forecasting, the automatic model selection procedure, it pretty much listed all of the different forecasting methods that we have. We have random walks. We have various types of trend models, moving averages, simple exponential smoothers, linear, quadratic, even seasonal exponential smoothers. We also have general ARIMA models. Another question asked if we could deal with an ARMA model, and we could. Right now, I actually asked it by default to try a whole variety of ARIMA models. ARIMA models where you take each of the terms of the models and let them go up to second order. So it fits models of first order, models of second order, various combinations. The automatic forecasting procedure actually fits all of those models. It may be fitting 100 different models. The only model that actually shows you in the end is actually the model that maximizes whatever criteria you've selected. Okay. And by default, that was the Kaiki information criteria. Okay. There's another suggestion I can see for an enhancement, and that is to add GARCH models, G-A-R-C-H. Okay, we don't have that at the moment. That sounds like something that would be interesting to add. I'm going to write that down here, put that in the hopper for future development. Okay. Incidentally, I didn't show you what you would get if you try to forecast unemployment in the United States. Actually, here's a picture of what the best forecasting model is. If you try to forecast that unemployment rate, the unadjusted figures, it comes up with a fairly complicated ARIMA model. And if you look at the forecast function, the forecast is that this nice decline in unemployment is likely to end. In fact, the forecasts for the next 12 years or so appear to go back up a little bit. You know, I don't think President Obama is going to like that very much. But it has decided, the automatic forecasting procedure, using the Kaiki information criteria, that the best forecast is that series may now turn around and go back up. And I have heard some economists suggest that that is a possibility over the next year or two. I also want to invite you all to send us or me directly suggestions, ideas for things you'd like to see put into Statgraphics. If you go to our website, that's statgraphics.com, you can see a summary of the many new things we did put into version 17. There are 32 new statistical procedures. There are major enhancements to 20 existing procedures, a lot of visualization, new control charts, a lot of new interactive statlets that you might be interested in. If you have ideas, though, for things you'd like to see in the product that we didn't put into version 17, send your ideas to either support@statgraphics.com or directly to me. That's Neil, Neil, at statgraphics.com. We compile a big list, and pretty much all of the new features that go into new versions of Statgraphics are features that have been asked for by users. Yeah, the website URL, it's just statgraphics.com. The name of the product.com. It's also a brand new website. If you haven't been there in a while, about a week ago, we put up a brand new website, which does include information about version 17. Okay. I see that there is another question about the difference between additive and multiplicative models. You may notice I didn't really point it out, but when we were doing the seasonal adjustment, there was an option of using either an additive or a multiplicative model. If I go to analysis options on the seasonal decomposition, at least I remember there being an option for whether you use an additive. Yeah, well, it's right here. You can see it's the method that it's used is multiplicative. You do have the option of choosing either multiplicative or additive. The primary difference is how we assume the different components to enter into the data. Let me go back here where I talked about the seasonal models, seasonal time series. I'm sorry. It was way back here when I talked about time series in general, I believe. There we are. In an additive model, you assume basically multiplicative effects. Okay? Percentage type changes in the data. That if the trend goes up, it makes a percentage change. Or if there's a seasonal effect, it makes a percentage change in the output. In an additive model, the trend, the cycle, the seasonality, and the randomness are just added into each other. They don't multiply each other. Now, for economic data, the multiplicative model seems to be by far the most common model. And that was the default when I did the seasonal adjustment, although I could have used an additive model instead. Okay. I see one other question. How do we model a time series variable, a daily variable that might represent assistance to a social program? I heard it's necessary to use a time series with a Poisson distribution. Typically, if we do have data like counts, particularly if the counts tend not to be very large, the first thing you would do is to take a square root. A square root of counts tends to stabilize the variance. That's part of the reason why on all of the procedures, it gives you the option internally of making a transformation if you need to. So, for example, when I did the seasonal decomposition, one of the options was to adjust the data in various ways. And if it had been count data, the first thing I probably would have done is taking the square root of that data. Various types of transformations which are useful for different types of variables. And all of the time series procedures give you the option, built-in option of doing these types of transformations. Because as with most statistical models, we do assume normally distributed error terms. And normally distributed with constant variance. So it's important if you do have data such as counts, to do a transformation before you fit the models. Okay, well, again, I want to thank you very much for inviting me to give this webinar. I tried, as you know, to give you a good idea of what's in the time series section of Statgraphics, gave you a sneak peek at some of the visualization procedures in particular that we've added to version 17.
Dr. Neil, sorry, can we take a few minutes more of your time? I have a couple of questions here.
Sure.
One of them is from Isabel, and she would like to know more about method selection criteria.
In the automatic forecasting procedure. Yeah, the automatic forecasting procedure allowed me to choose different method selection criteria to use. As you can expect, various statisticians have different ideas about what's likely to be the best way to select a model. We talk a lot when we do time series analysis, classical time series analysis, as finding models, for example, that minimize the mean squared error. That is, it looks at how a method performed over the time, on the time series, over the period where you have data, and tries to find a method, if you're minimizing the mean squared error, where the average squared forecast error, looking one period ahead, is as small as it can be. Now, that sometimes gives you a more complicated model than you might like. In general, the more complicated the model, the better chance it has of making the errors small. And if it makes them dramatically smaller, then the model is probably a better model. But a small reduction in the mean squared error may not be worth adding an additional parameter to the model. All of the procedures, the kite information criteria and the ones with different statisticians' names on, are methods of trying to penalize more complicated models to prevent us from overfitting the data. Now, even so, you can see, even with the kite information criteria here, the model that it's selected for the unemployment rates is really quite a complicated ARIMA model. It has, let's see, that's a difference, let's see, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 parameters, which is really quite a lot of parameters given that there were only 50 data points. If I had tried to minimize the mean squared error, I might have gotten even a more complicated model than that. If you look at our documentation, it does give you the various formulas for those different criteria. And incidentally, the best place to find the documentation, if you're using Statgraphics, if you go to the Help menu, there's a section called Procedure Documentation. There are about 200 PDF files that you can access there, one for each menu item. So if you looked at the document titled Automatic Forecasting, it would give you the equations for those different criteria. Was there another question?
Recuerda a las personas que tienen micrófono y desean hacer la pregunta directamente al doctor Neil, pueden levantar la mano, que la opción la encuentran en la parte media de sus pantallas. Igual les recuerdo que la pueden enviar vía chat en español y con gusto María Ángela la traducirá a nuestro instructor.
We have another question from Andres. It says, how can I visualize the forecast for a specific model?
I'm sorry, how can you?
Visualize the forecast for a specific model.
For a specific model.
Yes.
If you go to the forecast menu, you'll notice that there are two options. There's the user-specified model and the automatic model selection. In the case of the automatic model selection, the only forecasts it's going to show you are forecasts for the model that it picked. If you go to user-specified model, however, okay, you can pick any one model to fit. The analysis options here allows you to pick a particular model. So if you wanted to see, for example, what simple exponential smoothing might do with the data, you could pick that particular model. You could also ask for it, since it is seasonal data, for it to do a seasonal adjustment first, okay, and then apply simple exponential smoothing. Okay, and if you make that selection, it'll fit whatever particular model you want, and you'll see the forecasts just for that one model. So basically the answer is use the automatic forecasting procedure if you wanted to try a lot of different models. Use the user-specified procedure if you want to tell it what model to fit. It will give you similar output to this for whatever model you pick in that case.
Okay, another question we have here. Can I make one step ahead and multiple step forecasting?
Okay, when we do our forecasting, you can see here, for example, that it has forecasted, I believe, the next 12 or 24 months. Okay, this center line here are all forecasts made from the time of the last data point. So you have a one-step ahead forecast, a two-step ahead forecast, a three-step ahead forecast, and so forth. What it shows on the plot, okay, are, for the past, just the one-step ahead forecasts. And the error statistics that it calculates are based on the one-step ahead forecasts. Now, it has been shown and demonstrated that typically the way you get the best model is to minimize the error on the one-step ahead forecasts. So that's what we use to compute the error statistics. But the forecasts going forward are multiple step forecasts from the last data point going forward.
Thank you, Dr. Polhemus. Do you have time for more questions, or should we leave the ones that we have pending for a future presentation, or maybe for Cartagena?
Well, I have time. If there are more questions, I am not in a hurry, so I can certainly answer those.
Okay, yes, we have a question here from Nestor. The data set used in your presentation is available into the example set, or is it containing Statgraphics?
The data set that I used in the presentation, well, I used two. I used the World Bank data set, which I downloaded from the World Bank website, and the unemployment rates that I downloaded from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They are currently in Statgraphics format. They are what we call SGD files. I can certainly make those files available. they were in the public domain, and I have no problem making those available if people want to try out some of the procedures that I showed today. Perhaps I can put those in an email to you, and you can figure out a way to make them available to people that came to the webinar. They're fun. They're fun to look at, actually. It's a pretty nice set of data. It's hard to find a good set of data. I did have to do some serious hunting to come up with that particular data file, but I'd be happy to pass them on to everybody who came to the webinar today.
Great. It would be really helpful to receive those, and we will forward these to all the participants.
Okay, I will do that.
Dr. Polhemus, thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. On behalf of Software Shop and our participants, we'd like to thank you for your time.
Well, you're very welcome.
Thank you. It was valuable information. The visualization is amazing, and we look forward to seeing more of Statgraphics functionalities, its possibilities, and all of its great uses in Cartagena, in our Latin American convention, and as well as in future presentations. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. I enjoyed it.